Oh, if you want, and you don't feel like you have to, you can turn to John 7. We'll talk a little bit about something there. But good morning. It's actually good to see as many as are here today. I wondered whether or not we'd have very many because of the torrential rain we had this morning. Yep. Everyone's on travel, yeah. Wow. It's good that everyone here is here. That's awesome. No, I think it's just Tornado Alley's getting all the rain. But we will talk just briefly about an event that we see in John 7. I want to pick up again. Some of you weren't here last week, but I didn't finish talking about this ceremony of water libation. Do you remember as I talked about this, what of the festivals this appeared in? Which of the primary Jewish festivals did this ceremony of water libation that I mentioned last week occur in? The Feast of Tabernacles. And the Feast of Tabernacles was one of the primary celebrations that God commanded in law. But what we read last week was not everything that was done, that was traditionally done, we talked about tradition last week, not everything that was traditionally done in the midst of this festival was required by law. Thus, we get to a part of this water libation thing that the Sadducees and the Pharisees disagreed with how or what or whether it should even be done. But I want to take you first to John, simply because this was the exact same traditional ceremony that was happening in the time of Jesus' day. And let me just catch you up right quick. The ceremony of water libation, what would happen is that, remember, what time of year did the Feast of Tabernacles occur within? It was the fall. And the fall is after the harvest. And so the Festival of Tabernacles was a celebration. It was a big party because all of the harvest has already been taken in. It was a time where we remembered God's protection, and this celebration of water libation, the tradition of it was to present this offering to God so that you can have healthy rain and a good harvest next year. And so this is being done in Jesus' day. And what happens is the priests will go down. It's a 7-day affair. It's actually an 8-day affair. But the priest will go down. Sometimes, depending on the time, the era, traditions change just a little bit over time. But some traditions say that they only did it once and then they kept all the water in the temple for each day. Other traditions say that every day the priest would go down to the pool of Siloam or to the spring of Gihon. Now, most of the water in the area was rain-caught water. It didn't run anywhere. And it was what we would call stagnant water. But there was one spring near Jerusalem, the spring of Gihon, that constantly flowed. And the Jews called constantly flowing water living water. So when you see references in the Bible to living water, it represents, now mind you, not when Jesus uses it, but when the Jews use it, the term living water represents free-flowing water. Okay? And the spring of Gihon was a free-flowing water that was rerouted in the time of Hezekiah. Hezekiah actually diverted the flow into the city of Jerusalem so that they would have a fresh water supply in event of a siege. And in Hezekiah's time, there was a siege on Jerusalem. So that happened. So now, years later, priests would go down to the pool of Siloam where this was diverted, or somewhere along the line of that spring, that diverted spring, to get living water, free-flowing living water, and bring it back to the temple. And then, as tradition has it, this celebration, they would pour this living water into an area on the altar. One tradition has it that there were cups on the corners of the altar, and they would pour it into the cups of the altar. And this was to offer to God this free-flowing water to invite good rains and good harvest for the coming year, for the next year, and also to thank God for the rains and the harvest that just happened. It was a big celebration. They also brought fruit to the celebration, and then they brought big leafy branches of trees to the celebration, and they waved them all around. And so this is a party. And the frenzy, I mean, we read last week how priests would dance on the temple grounds, and people would watch in the celebration. And it just grew in anticipation until the last day. And in the last day, it was kind of amped up a bit more. And the priest would walk around with this water around the altar 7 or 8 times. And it was just a really big traditional deal. Now, in the midst of all of this, Jesus stands up. In John 7, let me find my verse, 37. And some of you may have a heading in your Bible, Jesus teaches at the festival, or even chapter 7, Jesus goes to the Festival of Tabernacles. That's this celebration that we're talking about. Verse 37, on the last and greatest day of the festival. And I told you, it really gets, the frenzy just really elevates until that last day, and then it's a big hoo-ha. Jesus stood in a loud voice. Now, get this. The priests are carrying this water. The anticipation is building. It's about to go in the cup, and everyone's like this. And Jesus stands up, and in a loud voice, he says, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink." Couldn't hear me, could you? Where did that come from? In the middle of this festival, the anticipation is growing. They're about to pour the water in, and Jesus says, "Guess what? You want living water? Come to me. Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." In the middle of this festival. Now, this is not a stranger. Jesus has been in their midst for a few days now. They know that he is a bit of a teacher. Some people think he's a bit of an oddball. But the fact that he interrupted this traditional celebration to say what he said, do you think that got attention? Yeah, that got attention. And then John has to explain what he meant. And it says, living water. By this, he meant the Spirit, whom those who believe in him were later to receive. The living water that they would have is the Spirit that would flow within them. Up to that time, the Spirit had not been given, since Jesus had not yet been glorified. But there is a time when Jesus is glorified and he said, "I'm going to send my Spirit," and that Spirit would flow freely within you. Flowing water, flowing Spirit, everlasting life, everlasting harvest. You see the connection? The celebration was about life and harvest and the benefit, God's sustaining you. And Jesus said, God sustains you through me. The Spirit that comes through me. Wow, that's pretty cool. To know that Jesus was willing to stand up in the middle of this frenzy and say this, remarkable thing, really had to have people question, what on earth? Now, let's go back to the time we're talking about. That was the time of Jesus. The same festival. And we talked about this occurrence last week. The same festival, the same frenzy. Now we're talking about good old AJ. You remember AJ? I talked about AJ last week. Alexander Jannaeus. Alexander Jannaeus was the priest king at the time of the Hasmonean dynasty. He was the one, remember, he was the brother who was in jail, the brother of Aristobulus. Aristobulus only ruled for a little bit before he died. And his wife, Salome Alexandra, got that brother out of prison and married him according to the law. And we went back to the law and we saw how that worked. So now this brother, Alexander Jannaeus, is king. Now Alexander Jannaeus allied himself. I will say he allied himself because we don't know necessarily whether he was a Sadducee, but he allied himself with the Sadducees. Now, we talked a little bit last week about the law and tradition. The Sadducees were the ones who administered over the temple, and they only focused on what part of the Bible? The first 5 books, the law of Moses. So if it wasn't in the law, they discarded it, or they didn't worry about it, or they didn't like it. One of those, depending on how they wanted to take it at that time. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles was in the law. But this celebration of water libation was not in the law. It was a tradition that somehow over time developed. Sadducees did not faithfully follow this celebration of libation. In fact, a lot of scholars think they hated it. And so, Alexander Jannaeus, who was high priest and king at the time, was the one who was taking the water. And he allied himself with the Sadducees. And instead of pouring it in the cup on the altar, where did he pour it? Those who were here last week? On his feet. How do you think everyone else reacted? They hated it. What is this? We all don't like it when our tradition is changed. Not only that, but when your tradition is built up in your mind as a religious requirement. When it is a law in your head, he just broke their tradition. He broke their common law, we'll call it that. They all had fruit in their hands because it was tradition that you bring fruit to this festival, especially on the last day. You also bring these big leafy branches. So they had fruit in their hand. They pelted the king, Alexander Jannaeus, with their fruit. He didn't like that. And he told his guards, kill him. 6,000 people on the temple grounds massacred that day. Yeah. Now, most of these people were not Sadducees. They were common people and Pharisees. Pharisees, more or less, and we talked about this a little last year, more or less represented the common people because of the shared lifestyle that they would have had. Pharisees' domain was not the temple. Pharisees' domain was the synagogues. And the synagogues were actually in the towns where the people lived. And that's where the people, if you had an issue, a religious question or a concern, you went to a Pharisee or a person, a religious doctor there in your town, which would have been a representative at the synagogue, most likely a Pharisee. So they represented the common people. So the 6,000 people who were massacred were Pharisees and the people who they represented. Now let's ask another question. What in your minds are reasons for civil war? If you were just going to say civil war exists, why does it exist? For what reasons would you fight a civil war? Say again? Difference of opinion. Now, do we think that I prefer blue and you prefer orange, that kind of difference of opinion? Okay, so what kind of opinion? What? Political. Okay, political opinions. Religious differences.
Those two often get inseparably linked together.
You betcha. You betcha.
Perceived loss of freedom.
Loss of freedom. Or we might say oppression. And pardon me if I misspell anything, but you know I'm not the speller in the world. Ethnic differences. And you know, I'm going to put on this not just ethnic differences, but we could say lifestyle or cultural differences. There's a lot that might be, you know, one's ethnicity is one thing, but also all of the culture that that person brings with them, with that ethnicity, might also be it. So I'll just put cultural differences. Moral differences. And sometimes that is linked to the religions. Or ethnic. Yeah, a lot of it. Yeah, one can't say that any one of these is independent of the other. That's the thing. When I know years ago, I had to go through all kinds of what do they call it? It's diversity training, I think is what they called it at one time. And the focus of these diversity trainings was very much race, but also gender. But what it often left out was Steve and I may have totally different, a very diverse life, different upbringings, different social surroundings, different religious beliefs, different socioeconomic class. We may have all kinds of differences. That was never introduced into these diversity trainings. It was all the outward expressions that you could see, the racial expression. You could see a difference in race. You could see a difference in gender. But there are so many nuances to diversity that we never talked about in these diversity trainings. But each one of those nuances may trigger or be a cause of civil disagreement. And when that disagreement gets so strong, it triggers a war. And this event, where 6,000 of my people were massacred during a ceremony that was meant to be for God, by golly, that's cause for war. And this moment ignites what we know of as a civil war among the Jews. This civil war was political and religious.
We're getting close today.
Yeah, we are getting close today. Yes, if we see another civil war, that's, yeah. But this war, it was not a war of the North and South. Remember, for years, sometimes we had the Northern Kingdom fighting against the Southern Kingdom. And then they would invite the people around them to help in that fight. This particular disagreement was a religious disagreement. Sadducees and Pharisees. And a war erupted, and over the next period of 6 years, 50,000 people died. 50,000 Jews died because of this internal religious civil war. It got so bad that the Pharisees, or the people who allied themselves with the Pharisees, I should say, asked for help from Syria against the Sadducees, or the people who allied themselves with the Sadducees. Now, you know what's ironic about that? Who were the people that were allied with the Sadducees? Descendants of Mattathias. You remember Mattathias? Mattathias and his boys rebelled against Syria because of the Hellenism that they were pushing, because they were forcing a religion on people. So now we have the Pharisees asking for help from the Syrians because the sons of Mattathias was forcing religion on them. And so the Syrians came in to help. And they finally got it to a point where I would call it there was balance. There was not a win. There was balance. And here's why. There came a point that the Pharisee side got to thinking, you know, if we carry this to its fullest extent, Syria is going to win. And if Syria wins, what happens? We lose anyway. We fall under Syrian control. So at that very last point, they abandoned Syria, and Syria lost. And you had a bit of a balance. In essence, they gave up. So you still had AJ in control. He was about to lose, but at the last minute he won. Peace, there was a edict of peace, you might call it. And it looked like things would settle down. However, there's always a however, right? Sadly, AJ pursued those people who went and sought help with Syria. Okay, there were certain numbers of them that actually went to Syria to ask for help. AJ tracked them down. And on one day, he and his Sadducean friends crucified 800 of the Pharisees. Not only did they do that, but before they killed them, they had their families killed before their eyes. So their wives and their sons and daughters were killed while they watched. And then they crucified them. 800 Pharisees. Now I ask you, when we get to the New Testament, do the Sadducees and Pharisees like each other? No. I mean, this drives it home, doesn't it? To be crucified, especially to a Pharisee, but also to a Sadducee, means to be cursed by God. Why is that? If we read in Galatians, let me see if I can find it right quick, 3:13. Galatians 3:13, Paul is talking about Jesus. And he says, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole or a tree. So everyone who is crucified is cursed by God in their writings. Where does that come from? Okay, let's flip over. Let's go to Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, let's see if I can find it right quick. And I can't. Deuteronomy 21:22. Deuteronomy, again, this is the law. Oh, look, I did have it marked. It's right here. 21, verse 22, various laws. If someone guilty of a capital offense is put to death and their body is exposed on a pole or a tree, you must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it that same day, because anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse. That's Deuteronomy. I won't go into the theology of what that means, under God's curse, but it does go into talking about the land. You must not desecrate the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. And remember, at one time I said God really, 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 really cares about his land. So, 800 Pharisees cursed. I mean, we do not like each other, Pharisees and Sadducees.
Were there really that many Sadducees? I mean, when you're talking about it, I'm kind of the impression that there were less Sadducees because it's a very specific religion. It's wealthy. It's
Right.
they're not with the common folk.
Right.
So
There
is it
weren't
just that they have money to hire mercenaries?
power. Yeah. Power. They were the ones in control. And so yes, they had and we do know John Hyrcanus hired outsiders to be his military.
So it's not that the Sadducees themselves are always the ones doing the might of these actions. They're the ones
Instigating it, controlling and instigating it. Yes. Yeah, kind of like, I go crazy sometimes when my friends would say, yeah, we built a house. No, they didn't. They didn't physically build the house. They had it built to their specifications maybe. But they didn't actually build the house. But they refer to it as they built the house. So we could say the Sadducees did this deed. They probably were not the ones getting their hands dirty putting these people on a pole.
But it would take a significant army to
Killed that many people.
That's,
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
what I was wondering is how did they control? Were they just outsiders being handed?
Well, now it's something, and I didn't research this. Wasn't able to. I didn't know this was going to come up.
Sorry.
But you had a cohort of people called the temple guards. In fact, the temple guards are the ones that came and arrested Jesus. It wasn't Roman guards that arrested Jesus. It was temple guards. So you had a cohort of people who were facilitating a military-style guardianship around the Sadducees, the temple, and all things religious devotion. They're the same ones who would have been the ones to massacre the 6,000 people inside the temple grounds. They obeyed the high priest and king. Now, those were separate. Usually those were separate from the king had his own military. And because we had a high priest and king who were the same person, he could have easily used his own military for those purposes.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So that's just kind of setting the setting here. Now, as everyone has to eventually, AJ dies. What happens when AJ dies? Well, remember his wife. AJ still has that wife, who was actually wife of Aristobulus before. They had kids, but what he says is he gives Salome Alexander the rule. Now, his wife cannot maintain the role of high priest. A woman can't be high priest. So Salome Alexandra, as his wife, takes the rule, the queenship, the kingship, and it becomes a queenship, and gives the high priesthood to their first son, Hyrcanus II. For the next, I want to say 9 years, but I could be wrong. Let me look. Oops. 9 years from BC, from 76 BC to 67 BC. Remember, we count backwards in BC. She was queen, sole ruler of Judea. You didn't have a king, you had a queen. Now, if you remember, we actually had this occurrence one time before. It's actually in the Bible, in Chronicles, when we had a queen of Judea. Does anyone remember who that queen was? I hope so, because I can't. Nope, but that's good. Queen Esther actually was queen in Persia. But she actually had a king. But Israel, or Judea, didn't have a king at this time. They had a queen. And the queen years before was evil. Didn't like her. Remember, her son was Joash. Which one was it? If I can find my notes. No. Not Josiah, apparently. Must have been Joash. Don't you hate it when you can't find what you know is there? Well, I'm having a hard time finding it. But we had a queen before, and that queen is mentioned in Chronicles, and I'm sorry, I cannot. Say again?
Was it Jezebel?
No. She was Ahab and Jezebel were the northern kingdom. This was southern kingdom, had a queen, and I even remember, we actually put it on the board when we were at that time period. But here we are again, we have just a queen. And Salome Alexandra was the queen, the ruler, during this time. Now, here's the fascinating fact. Her brother, remember, her husband was a Sadducee who really did all these cruel things to Pharisees. Her brother, we believe, was a Pharisee. So, Queen Salome Alexandra, while her husband lived, rumor has it, tried to protect the Pharisees in any way she could. It's believed that she even hid some of them. So what happens when AJ dies and she gets to be the ruler? Who do you think she allied herself with? Her brother and the Pharisees. Now, she was a bit more balanced both in the head and in her rule. She brought more Pharisees into leadership roles in Jerusalem. Now, if you remember, what was the leading body of judicial body, I should say? What is the leading judicial body of the Jews? Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin. They were a religious and civil court, you might say. What she did was she put more Pharisees into the Sanhedrin, put more Pharisees into the judgment kind of roles. And what happened when you do this, do you think the Pharisees might have still held a grudge? Yeah. So what she had to do was she had to establish cities outside of Jerusalem that the Sadducees could go to and not hide, but be safe. They were protective cities from the Pharisees because of the retribution that the Pharisees wanted to have against the Sadducees because of all of these years of buildup and the cruelty that AJ had done. But she recognized that this was an issue, so she made peace. She made peace with the Pharisees, and she sought to help the Sadducees in ways that she understood could be helped. So she gave them protective cities that they could live in. Now, that's really, she tried to expand the borders, was not very successful. Her other son, Aristobulus II, was the military leader. So Hyrcanus II was the high priest. Aristobulus II was the military leader. Toward the end of her reign, Aristobulus decided he wanted control, so he tried to have a coup against his mother. That failed. But as soon as his mother died, Hyrcanus II was given the rule as well as the high priesthood. So now we have Hyrcanus II, who is the king and the high priest, and this is in 67 BC. Aristobulus, who thinks that he got the shaft, comes in and takes over, kicks his brother out. So the coup didn't work with his mother in charge, but the coup did work with his brother in charge. His brother, Hyrcanus II, never really wanted to be, I can't say wanted, never really was a good military leader. And so any battle that he had to fight, he usually lost. And in this case, he lost to his brother. And so then the kinghood, he was only king from 67 to 66. Then Aristobulus II came in. Should I be writing this on the board? Aristobulus II came in 66. Things happen really fast now. Aristobulus II kicked Hyrcanus II, his brother, out of town. And his brother ran, this is good to write down. Judea. Samaria, Galilee. Right? Who lives down here? Edomites. Who were the Edomites? Descendants of Esau. Hyrcanus got kicked out of town. Whew, and he ran down here. Now, someone else, I told you things move really, really fast. Names. Hyrcanus. There'll be a test next week. Second, Aristobulus. Aristobulus. I don't know if that's spelled right or not. The second. And Antipater. Okay. When Hyrcanus II was king, and probably even before that, most likely when AJ was king, this fella Antipater was in the government in some form or fashion. He was an aide in the government. Antipater was what they call an Idumean. Idumean was also known as an Edomite. So he had kind of gotten himself placed in position way back when. And so through all of these crazy handoffs and civil wars, he's just kind of doing his thing. Taking care of business in the background. Hyrcanus gets run off to the land of this guy. Aristobulus is now in power. Antipater's still there doing his thing. Okay? But some of his thing is stirring the pot. And so what he does is he stirs the pot a bit and gets the folks down here, gets Hyrcanus to recruit the folks down here, really through some bribes, to come and attack Jerusalem to kick his brother back out. So here's what happens. Aristobulus is here, Hyrcanus is here, Antipater is here, but Antipater is kind of in the background. Hyrcanus comes back into Jerusalem to kick Aristobulus out. And he's got this big army of, we're going to say Edomites. It's actually a Nabutians, or there's another word. I can't remember the word that, do I even have it? I didn't write it down. But it's a king of, starts with an N, but it's from this area. He brings his military up and starts attacking Jerusalem. Starts winning. And what happens is he actually reconquers Jerusalem. Aristobulus kind of holds himself up in the temple, just like Hyrcanus did when Aristobulus attacked Jerusalem. You know, the temple's the safe place, right? But they both send ambassadors to Rome. Wait a minute, where'd Rome come in? Why on earth do we send anyone to Rome? Back up. Back up quite a bit. And remember, who was in charge? Grecian Empire. Now, things that were happening, forget all this. This map goes up here. Things were happening up here all the time. We're talking about things happening here. Remember, Judea was independent for the last 100 years. During those 100 years, I like your thinking. During those 100 years, things were still happening up here. And Rome eventually conquered and started growing their empire. Not only that, they conquered Egypt. Started growing their empire that way. As this happened, Rome acknowledged Judah as an independent nation. But Judah, in order to protect itself from various other nations, had to rely on Rome to protect its independence. And so they were allies to Rome. Judah was an ally to Rome during this time. So now we're having this skirmish inside. They go to Rome and say, we need this settled. Initially, the Roman leader in charge gave it to Aristobulus.
You said they, both Aristobulus and Hyrcanus?
Yes. Yes. Both of them went to Rome and said,
Just one of them going?
no. They said, let's get this settled. They went to Rome, and Rome said, Aristobulus, you have it. And forced that army out. Out. Now, what happened, though, is it didn't exactly come down the way that they expected. And as it follows up, another bunch of people go to Rome and say, this isn't quite right. But now, and people always say 3 parties went to Rome. They say parties for Aristobulus went to Rome, parties for Hyrcanus went to Rome, and a third party. We don't necessarily know who that third party was, but we can kind of guess who that third party might have been. Well, this time they went to Pompey. Remember Pompey, well, you may not remember. Pompey was the military leader who was in charge of this whole area, and eventually his son Titus is the one who conquered Jerusalem. But they went to Pompey. Pompey, now this is the second visit to Rome. And when I say Rome, I don't mean the city Rome. I mean the nation Rome and its representatives. Pompey was not in Rome. They went to Pompey, and Pompey this time, the second visit, said, I'm going to support Hyrcanus. Why do you think he might have done that? Because Hyrcanus looked like the weaker one. You want to set up a weaker king so that they will bow to you when the time comes. They will cow down to you when the time comes. They won't rebel against you. So he set up Hyrcanus. Not necessarily as king, because, hey, if you guys can't settle your own stuff, we're just going to come in and we're going to take over. So they supported Hyrcanus as the leader, the ruler, and kicked Aristobulus out. So Aristobulus' reign was only 3 years. Let's see, this guy was 67 to 66. This was 66 to 63. And in 63, what happened is they said, no more here, let's go back here. But he wasn't established as king at that time. He was just reestablished as the high priest, and he was given a little bit of control. But most of the control now relied with Rome. Because somehow he was able to negotiate. Yeah. He negotiated the political affairs such that he now represented Rome. And so he, though high priest and ruler, did what he needed him to do. So really, Antipater was the controller of what's going on after 63. Now, as it happens, we're actually, believe it or not, I think we're going to get to Matthew next week. Woo-hoo! Yeah. As it happens, Antipater was the kind of guy that could shift his politics to whoever was in power. As we've already seen, he did fairly effectively. So when it came to Rome, and Rome had its own skirmishes, who was going to be in power. He shifted alliances back and forth. And in 47 BC, Rome, probably through negotiations with Antipater, assigned Hyrcanus to be etnarch. What's my word? I want to say it's etnarch. Rome had all these positions of power throughout. Restored to high priest and appointed etnarch by Julius Caesar. Now, I won't I'll spare you the details. Antipater vacillated and finally landed on Caesar, although at one time he was against Caesar. But he was really good at making people believe he was all in for you. Obviously, devout Jews didn't like him, Antipater, and he died in prison. Now, in the midst of all of this, Antipater and his son went to Rome. In fact, when Antipater died, his son Herod became governor of this area. Hyrcanus was still high priest. Now, what happened was there was a bit of an where Aristobulus' son came in and tried to reestablish his throneship. And Herod went to Rome. While Herod was in Rome, the Senate in Rome gave him the title king. So Herod, this is the Herod that was ruling when Jesus was born. Herod comes back from Rome. He thought he was word on the street is he thought he was making peace among these guys. He probably had a lot of his dad's gusto in him. And so somehow it was negotiated so that the Senate established him as king of Judea. So he comes back in 40 BC. Herod, we know him as Herod the Great, is now king of Judea. What did Herod do for us? He actually did. Herod refurbished and expanded the temple. He was a big constructionist. He was one of the first who used cement that would harden underwater. And so he built a port with a big, long wave break and whatnot, and I can't remember where, Caesarea or one of those places. He built this, and you can still see parts of it today, using this underwater cement so that ships can travel directly from Rome to Jerusalem or Judea. He made that possible. He also built the Herodium. He built several, I'm going to call them, I don't know what, the word escapes me. Forts, basically. He built several forts that could be used in times of war or in times of escape. There were a lot of things civilly that he did for Jerusalem. And although, remember, he is son of Antipater, so he is also from Edomite. Jews didn't like him, but he endeavored to ingratiate himself to the Jews. Okay? And remember, these people were forced to have the Jewish religion. They were forced into Judaism by who? John Hyrcanus, the very first of the Hasmonean kings, opened the door for this to happen. So now we have a king, Herod, in Jerusalem, who's an Edomite, despised by the Jews, And yet he's doing a lot of things civilly for the country. But again, he's political. He's all about politics. He's all about himself. And I won't go into his death yet because we get into that in Matthew. Woo-hoo. But there are things that happen and that he does that are unreal as well. As unreal as 6,000 people dying in the temple in one day, as unreal as 800 Pharisees being crucified. That we talked about some serious stuff today, didn't we? Well, Herod has his own characteristics. But this is a rough time. I did not talk about Roman rule. Rome came in when Aristobulus, that skirmish that happened here, they couldn't resolve it. Pompey says Hyrcanus can have it. People from Aristobulus' side didn't like that, so they shut in Jerusalem. Now, Pompey had something to do, so he went off and he left his son Titus in control. Titus is the one that conquered Jerusalem. And in conquering Jerusalem, the walls were damaged and the temple was damaged. That's what Herod said about rebuilding. So not only repairing the damage from the Roman siege, but also expanding it. And Rome was now in control. And when another country is in control, they bring their troops in and they station their troops in the area. So we have gone through about 100 and some odd years of freedom, absolute freedom. Now you can see, looking back, why we had so many people. The Jews were desperate for someone who could get rid of Roman control. Because if that freedom had not been theirs for the last 100 years, and they had lived their life under Babylonian control, lived their life under Persian control, lived their life under Greek control, now live their life under Roman control, that would be their lifestyle. They wouldn't know what life was like in freedom. They wouldn't know that there was something to look forward to in freedom. But because they had freedom, and now all of a sudden, Rome's in control, now we had people, zealots, who wanted to kick Roman control out. And we see that in the New Testament. We see that in Matthew. And when we see Jesus come in as King of the Jews, and people in their mind are thinking, ooh, we have a Messiah. We have someone who's going to kick Rome out. See how narrow-minded that is? But that is why they think that way. They had independence and they lost it. And they want that independence back because they think in independence, Israel will grow and take over the world in a religious fashion. That's where we are. Now, I will confess, we're not going to dig into Matthew right off the bat next week because we want to talk about what is a gospel. Why do we have what we have in the way of different gospels? Those kinds of things. We want to talk through that, but we are now at Matthew. Woohoo! But you just went through about 11 weeks of what we call the intertestament period. It's a time that most people, one, don't know exist, or two, are just unaware of what happened during that time. And when you get to the New Testament and you start reading some of these fascinating facts, all we know is just that little bit of, Sadducees don't believe in resurrection. And they disagree with the Pharisees. But now you know the vigor with which they disagree with one another. And the history of why they disagree. And my goodness, you put my old granddaddy on a cross. Are you nuts? Okay. So I enjoy that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, all this history, I love it. Who compiled it all? Was it a collection?
It is a...
And whose viewpoint? Was it from the...
Very good question. Who compiled it and with whose viewpoint? And we are already over time, but let me say there are a few historians, both Jewish and Gentile, that we can rely on. Josephus is a huge source. Josephus was a Jew who we believe worked in the Roman government or military, and he wrote for us a fairly thorough history of what happened. However, we do know that there are some biases that he has. And so we look to other historical sources for that. And over time, we're able to compile a fairly accurate history of what happened. However, you'll notice there were questions you asked and some others asked that I really can't answer because we don't have the evidence. We can suspect some things, but we've got, anytime you have a king, you have people writing down events of the king. And then when you have empires coming in and taking over other empires, you have people who lived through it and they want to write it down. In much the same way that we have the Gospels and people who wanted to write down the events of Jesus. So we do have people who are writing letters. Letters is a good source where so-and-so writes a letter to Rome. Hey, this is happening in our country or in our town. Can you help? Or what are the resources that are available to us? And so we have some evidences just by personal letters, some actual historians who are trying to make a record of the events. And then some people just look back over time. You might have had people in the first century A.D. who are writing about events that happened the prior 200 years. We do that today, where we write about our history, and we want to make sure that our history is not forgotten. And so you have some writings that reach back a little bit, and there are some of those. But I will say Josephus is a huge part of this. And then you have the Maccabees. We read through bits of the Maccabees. So you have other writings that we can piece things together over time. And we've had 2,000 years to figure it out. But in the last 100 years, we've really made great strides both in archaeology and textual criticism so that we can see what really happened and whether or not it was biased or factual. Great question, though. Great question. All right, let's pray right quick, and we'll be dismissed. Lord, thank you so much for this journey through the Intertestament period. Thank you for helping us to see the activities that occurred within the Jewish kingdom during these times, from the time when the Jews were taken away into Babylon all the way down to when your Son was born into them. Father, thank you so much for this opportunity that we can look at this in freedom and to study your word in freedom. Thank you for these people and the love that we share together. And be with us as we go out into the world. Be with us that we may shine your light, but also keep us in health, keep us in safety. Pray this through your Son's name. Amen.